Hey first graders, I am in Lucy's playroom and I want to show you some examples of how we're learning about length and measurement. One of the things that I want to talk about is how you can compare the length of things. So some of the words, some of the vocabulary words you might use if you're comparing a length of something, you might be saying something is shorter, or you might say something is longer or taller. Those might be some words you use when you are comparing two different lengths. If you are ordering lengths, if you're putting the lengths of objects in order, you might use different words like shortest or tallest or longest or shorter. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of those, how you can measure things. And remember that we're not using rulers yet in first grade. We're just using different objects to measure with. You have to just make sure that the objects that you pick are the same exact object so that it makes it nice and even, and you're not going to have any gaps or any spaces between. So I'm going to show you a few of the objects that I picked out. So I have just some of these orange squares that I could use to measure things. If I decide to use these, I just need to make sure my squares are touching and that there's no gap between them. And then I want to line them up in a nice straight line. So that's one object that I found that I could use. I found some of Lucy's crayons that I could use. The thing about using crayons is you have to make sure that they're all the exact same size. You can't use one full crayon and then one broken crayon, or your measurement will not be accurate. So I just used these crayons that she has that are these twistable ones, and I twisted the crayon all the way down so that my crayons are exactly the same length. So this could be used as a tool for measuring if your crayons are all exactly the same size. So I was able to make these exactly the same size, so these could be used as measuring tools as well. The other thing that I have is just some toothpicks. As long as you make sure that your toothpicks are lined up and there's no space in between, these could be used as another tool for measuring as well. We'll just line them up. The thing with the toothpicks is we want to make sure that they don't overlap each other or our measurement will not be correct. We want to make sure that they're touching kind of like this and in a straight line, and we'll see which measurement we get using toothpicks. The other thing that I have is just a different type of block. So some of these blocks that she has, we could just line these up and see how many blocks it would take to get the measurement. The other object that we would have used if we were at school would have been paper clips, but I don't have any paper clips. So I'm just going to use the objects that I found around my house. If you want to try measuring some things around your house, you could look and find some measuring tools like I did, some cubes or some squares or some crayons or toothpicks, whatever it is you can find. So let's start by comparing some lengths. So we're going to be using some of these words. Is it shorter? Is it longer? Is it taller? And we're going to compare two objects. So here's some of the objects that I found we can measure. Just this watercolor. We can measure this marker. I have a puzzle of Lucy's that we could measure. So we can compare the lengths of things, and I'll use some of these objects that I have here below. So I think I'm going to measure first the puzzle, and I'm going to compare it with the length of the marker, and I'm going to see if any of these vocabulary words would make sense when I'm explaining what I've found. So let me move over here, and you can kind of see what I'm doing. Now, when you're comparing two objects, you have to make sure that you use the same object to measure with. So if I'm measuring the puzzle here, what I'll do is I'll just push it right up here against the edge so I know it's nice and straight. And I'm going to start by measuring with these orange cubes. When you're measuring something, you want to make sure that you're lining up right at the beginning of where your object starts. It wouldn't make sense to start measuring from right here, or we're not going to have an accurate measurement. So we're going to start right at the beginning where the object begins. And the other thing that's really important is notice how my squares are perfectly matched up. If I lay my squares down like this, is this going to work correctly? No, it's not, because I have space and gaps in between my squares. Your squares have to be touching, they have to be lined up, and they have to be in a nice, neat order so that you can see how many squares. All right, so I'm just going to keep lining these up here until I get to the very end of the puzzle. I am measuring from one end to the other. All right, let's see if I can fit a whole nother square in there. It doesn't really fit a whole square, so I'm going to say this is a half of a square at the end here. But let me count and see how many I've got. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and a half. So I have 11 and a half of these orange squares that it would take to measure this puzzle. Now I'm going to compare that with maybe the length of this marker. So I'm going to start from the beginning, and now I'm going to measure this marker. I'm going to put it back here so it doesn't roll. And I'm going to line up my squares just like I did with the puzzle, starting from one side to the other side. You're going to go from this end all the way to the other end, and then stop once you reach that end. So 2, making sure that my squares are touching, that there's no gaps or space in between the objects. I want to make sure that my objects aren't overlapping. It's a little hard to overlap these, but if I was using toothpicks, I want to make sure that my toothpicks were perfectly lined up and not overlapping. Alrighty, so there is the length of our marker. So for the puzzle we had 11 and a half. For the marker I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now's where we can start thinking about some of these vocabulary words. So when we're describing the puzzle, would you say that the puzzle is shorter or longer? You would say that the puzzle is longer, and the reason why we know that it's longer is because it took 11 and a half squares and the marker only took 5. So the puzzle is longer, the marker is shorter. We could also say that the puzzle is taller, but that would only be if we were kind of standing it up and measuring something that was going up. But so the puzzle was longer, the marker was shorter. So those are some of those comparison words that you might be using. So now let's do ordering objects. So for this you might use words like shorter, shortest, taller, tallest. So I need to have maybe a third object to put in here. So I know that the marker is 5. I know that the puzzle is 11 and a half. Let's do this watercolors. So now instead of having my marker, let's do the watercolor here. So I'm going to line these up from one end to the other in a nice straight line with no gaps in between, and I want to see how many squares it takes to measure this object. So I've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right, so the marker was 5. The watercolors here is 9, and the puzzle was 11 and a half. So with these 3 objects that I have here, which of these 3 objects was the shortest? The marker was. The marker was the shortest because it only took 5 squares. Which of these objects was the longest? The puzzle was. And then our kind of medium middle object was the watercolor. So we could say shorter or shortest. We could say longer, longest. Okay, remember that there are different ways to measure, so if you have other things at your house besides little squares like this, you can use all kinds of things to measure. If I wanted to measure the puzzle with markers, it would just take, or with crayons, it would just take less crayons because the crayons are a longer object. When you're measuring something that's longer, you might choose a longer object to measure with. For example, if you're measuring a table, if I was measuring my kitchen table, I probably wouldn't want to use toothpicks because that would take me a really long time to line them up and set them down. But if I used these crayons, I probably would be able to measure my kitchen table a little bit better because this is a longer object. Whatever you are using, it's okay as long as you make sure that you're using the same object when you are comparing different lengths. You have to make sure, just like I did with the puzzle, the marker, and the watercolor, I used the same unit to measure with, and that was what I chose, was the orange square. So when you're comparing lengths, you can use any type of object to see which is going to be longer or taller or shorter, but you have to make sure that you're using the same object to measure with. Okay, so remember to do your iReady lessons about this. You do have blue lessons that are showing up in your iReady this week. This will help you with this, and you'll be able to use your iReady to pull up some cubes and some squares and measure some objects on your iPad or on your computer. So try that. If you have some objects at home that you're curious about, you can get some objects like I did here, some blocks or some squares or crayons or paper clips or toothpicks, whatever you have at home, and you can try measuring some things at home and seeing if you can compare which is shorter or longer or taller and see what you can come up with. Have fun!